This is my talk, The Science of Learning, How Learning Works. My name is Safeer. I'm a software developer working for a company called And Digital. So, going back to 2018, I was starting my first real programming job. And even though I was starting to establish myself in my career, I didn't feel confident in my skills. My background isn't in computer science or development. I studied business management at university and taught myself everything I know about programming. And so, being surrounded by other experienced programmers, I just felt really behind. I wanted to progress quickly in my career, but felt like it was always 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The more I progressed, the more I felt like I was still behind. I needed a way to figure out how to catch up. I wanted to grow my career, but I was never going to match the years of experience that others had. And so, I came up with a solution that was not to try to outwork people who had years on me, but instead to work smarter than them. That is, to optimize every bit of learning that I do, to really maximize the value I got from it. And so I turned to the theory of learning to study how to actually learn effectively. Through this, I stumbled across something which blew me away. There's a lecture given by a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Carl Wyman, who compared modern day teaching and learning methods to bloodletting as a treatment by doctors 2,000 years ago. Doctors and patients believed it was an effective treatment because people would later go on to recover. But obviously, it was proven that bloodletting had no effectiveness in or any basis as an effective treatment. And so Carl Wyman basically said that the way that we learn and we teach is essentially the same. There's no actual evidence or science that the things that we do actually help our learning. In fact, some of the methods that we use, we actually learn in spite of those. And so this revelation was huge for me. I realized that if I could delve into the theory and the science and research of how learning works, then maybe I could figure out more effective methods that could help me. And so over the course of a year or more, I spent every day studying really deeply, all into all of the science and research of how learning actually works. I read countless books, articles, research papers, and more. I also applied all of this knowledge to my own learning, my own programming at my job to really understand it. Fast forward to now, a year and a half later, I feel completely different. All of that learning has had a huge impact on me. I feel completely in control. I know exactly how and what I need to do to grow and to improve. Learning how to learn effectively has been a game changer for me. 2019 was the biggest growth year of my career, and I finally stopped feeling insecure about my skills. I feel fully established in my career, and I feel excited about the future. And so in this talk, I want to share all of those learnings that have had such a huge impact on me to help everyone else be empowered in control of their learning and to maximize all of the learning and development they do. Cool, okay. So before we start, I'll just go through a quick agenda. So first I'll talk about how learning actually works, and I'll dispel one of the biggest myths about learning. I'll then talk about 2 qualities that experts possess that novices don't. I'll talk about the science behind it all, and then I'll go into some solutions how you can actually improve your learning. So, how does learning actually work? Well, in the beginning, when you're brand new to something, you're just learning it from the start, you're mostly just absorbing as much information as possible about the topic. You're just trying to cram in as many concepts as possible into your brain. And that's okay. That's fine. That's what you should be doing. But after the beginning, after a while, learning more actually stops being the way that you improve or develop. And so it turns out that one of the biggest myths is that more knowledge is what you need to get better. Because actually, after a while, after not too long, you'll know most of the things you need to know to solve most of the problems you're going to face. And so learning more is not the way you get better. And so if learning more is not the way you get better, how do you get better? It turns out that learning and development is actually about how you use the knowledge you have. It's about learning to use your knowledge better. Because having knowledge and knowing how to use it are not the same thing. You can have knowledge, but you can be poor in your ability to use it. And so it turns out that experts actually possess certain qualities, certain things they can do with their knowledge. And this, almost this is what separates them from novices, not actually how much knowledge they have. And so in this talk, I'm going to talk about two of the main qualities that experts possess that novices don't. And actually, if you can develop these qualities, these are the main things that will help you to get to expertise. And so they are identifying relevant information and skipping steps in thinking. So let's dive into them. So, like I said, after the beginning, novices actually have most of the knowledge they need to solve most of the problems they're going to face. But actually what they can't do is they can't identify when that knowledge is important. When they're looking at a problem, they can't filter between the knowledge they have and figure out which is relevant and which is not relevant for solving the problem. And the classic kind of symptom of this is when a novice can't solve a problem and somebody explains the solution to them and they go, okay, I understand the solution, but I would never have got there on my own. And that's a symptom of this problem, of an inability to identify the relevant and irrelevant information. And so to flesh out this with an example, I'm going to show you a clip from an episode of Dr. House. And House is in the show famously kind of like a genius doctor who's just operates at a much higher level than anyone else and can come up with these crazy genius moments. But actually what this clip is going to show you, and what actually happens in every episode of the show, is that all that House is doing different, all that differentiates House from the other doctors, is simply his ability to identify which information is relevant. That's it. So quickly before I show the clip, some context of the episode. So this guy is a professional cyclist, and he gets admitted into hospital when he collapses during a race. At the beginning of the episode, he admits to House that he had been blood doping, as in like injecting himself with blood, as a kind of performance enhancement mechanism. But later on in the episode, he starts to develop some symptoms, including the inability to create his own red blood cells and a loss of feeling in his legs. So at this point in the episode, the doctor's consensus is that this is being caused by use of an illegal performance-enhancing drug called EPO, which has given him something called acute PRCA.
But it's 16%. He passed out, had to be resuscitated, and he still can't move his legs.
It's not possible. The drug should be flushing out of his system.
Can't leave if they don't exist.
The EPO use explains every one of his symptoms. He's been lying and cheating, and now it's coming back to bite him.
The only problem with that theory is it's based on the assumption that the universe is a just place. If it were, then his poor manager wouldn't have been fired for no reason.
Lambert Eaton.
His chest was clear.
So we run an electromyography test.
You're still not explaining the PRCA.
What's his red count now?
I had to give him a blood transfusion. He's back around 30.
He needed a transfusion?
Well, he was losing blood, so I thought maybe he needed blood.
Go forth and scan his neck.
His neck?
Or repeat everything I say in question form.
We found a thymoma.
How'd you know to look in his neck? Thymomas usually present in the chest.
I knew it wasn't in his chest. All we've done since he checked in is look at his chest.
All the more reason not
There
to
are two
think.
types of PRCA. Acute comes on suddenly, chronic takes its time. We all thought Jeff's was acute because it happened right in front of us. What if it had been there for months, maybe years?
There's no way. It would have kept him from racing. With that kind of anemia, he would have needed constant...
Blood transfusions.
Which he was getting in convenient blood doping form.
He was treating himself without even knowing it.
Up to half of patients with chronic PRCA have a thymoma. And up to half of patients with a thymoma, I've always wanted to do this.
Okay, cool. So a quick summary of what happens in that clip is that so the patient actually didn't have acute PRCA; he had chronic PRCA, but they didn't see it because the fact that he had been treating himself, the fact that he had been injecting himself with blood for performance enhancement reasons, actually, without knowing, he was treating himself, and so they didn't actually see the symptoms until he got to hospital. So that's what happens in the clip. But as I mentioned, what actually happens is just the house is identifying information, relevant information and irrelevant information, much better than the other doctors. So let's go through that. So, firstly, House is already skeptical that EPO use is the correct explanation. And so, while the other doctors can't understand why it's not flushing out of his system and he's not getting better, House has already disregarded that as irrelevant information. Then, when Dr. Foreman mentions the blood transfusion, House recalls the original information about the blood injections, the blood doping he'd been doing, and he recognizes that as relevant information. And so, even though the other doctors aren't even thinking about that, it's out of their minds. It happened a long time ago. House has remembered it, and he's got it at the forefront of his mind as relevant information. Then House recognizes that there's two types of PRCA, chronic and acute. And even though it seemed impossible that he had the chronic version, because the symptoms came on so suddenly, he did not rule that out. And it's because of that, his ability to recognize that and piece all the information together, that he was able to come up with the correct diagnosis. And so, again, all that really happens is that House is thinking about the right information at the right time, and that helps him come to the right conclusion. And actually, the other doctors don't have any less knowledge, and you can see that because in the end, they actually explain the diagnosis themselves. They kind of had that aha moment, and then they kind of go, oh, so he must have been treating himself with the blood transfusions. So they don't have any less knowledge because they also got to that point, but they just didn't think about the right things at the right time in the way that House did. Cool. So that's identifying relevant information. The next quality is skipping steps in thinking. Experts can combine many ideas into single, large, meaningful units of information called chunks. And this idea of chunking is really fundamental to the ability to think at a high level. Because if you think of every individual element of a problem and potential solutions, you'll get overwhelmed very quickly. And the reason for that is that the working memory, the part of your brain that actually holds all the information you're thinking about, that can only hold up to 4 to 5 pieces of information at once. And so thinking about all these individual things is going to go way past the 4 to 5 limit, and it's going to overload your memory. And this is what happens to novices. Novices very often get overwhelmed very quickly when they start to think about all the different elements in a problem and try and come up with solutions. But experts actually don't have this. They don't get overwhelmed as easily. Because experts and the brain have a way to get around this, which is if you can understand how the little pieces combine into bigger pieces, the brain actually treats one large collection of information, one big combination of information as one thing or one chunk. And so you can actually fit lots and lots of ideas and thoughts into your brain if you can group them into 4 to 5 different chunks. And so this has huge implications for problem solving. Because if you can think about all these different things, all this information, all these different threads, understand all the elements and how they come together, you can actually think at a really high level. And so experts have this huge advantage over novices because of this ability in their problem solving. So it's obviously an issue that novices can't do this. But there's another problem. So experts have something called unconscious competence. They don't know that they're skipping steps. Experts are unconscious to the fact that there are pretty important steps and pieces of information that they've chunked away into bigger concepts. And novices have something called unconscious incompetence, which is that they don't know what they don't know. And so when these two groups come together, which they often are, because novices a lot of the time are learning from experts, either directly or indirectly, through courses, videos, tutorials, in person, etc. So neither of these groups are actually aware that there are crucial steps in the concept that are being missed out. Because the expert doesn't know that there's these little in-between steps that need to be taught because it's so automatic for them. They don't actually consciously think about them. And novices obviously don't know what they don't know, so they can't recognize what it is that's missing that's causing them to not fully understand concepts, or actually they might not even know that they have a lack of understanding, and that can later on hurt them. And so this is a huge problem because this pretty much happens all the time, because experts are almost always the source of information for novices. And so to flesh this out with another example, imagine a master chef teaching an apprentice cook. The master chef might say things like, saute the vegetables until done, cook sauce until good consistency, or add spices to taste. And that might make sense to a chef, but for the apprentice cook, they don't necessarily know what all that means. What does it actually mean that the vegetables are done? What is good consistency in a sauce? What spices create what taste? And so the expert chef actually assumes a lot of knowledge and doesn't recognize these foundational concepts in between steps that isn't understood by everyone. Cool. Okay, so those are the two qualities. Let's now talk about the science behind it. These are neurons in the brain connected to each other through synapses. This is probably pretty familiar imagery to most people. But this is basically what knowledge looks like. Knowledge is connected to other pieces of knowledge in the brain. And it's this idea of connections which is the cornerstone that underlies everything that's been discussed in this talk. Experts actually have many, 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 many more connections between all the knowledge in their brain, and those connections are stronger. And it's these connections that allow them to think at such a high level. Because if you can see how all your knowledge in a topic is connected and related, this allows you to look at a problem and see which pieces of information are relevant for you to need to get to a solution to the problem. And it also allows you to filter out which piece of knowledge are irrelevant. And if you can see the deeper underlying, less obvious connections and relationships, that actually allows you to see and understand which information is relevant that maybe others can't see. And that's exactly what went on in that house clip. He could see those relationships better. He had those connections and better relationships. And that's what allowed him to pick out that relevant information much better. Likewise, if you can see how information combines into different categories and groupings, that then allows you to chunk information and create these bigger and bigger chunks. And so the key to all of this, the key to learning and getting better after the beginning, after you're kind of learned that most of the things you need to know, it's all about developing connections between that knowledge in your brain. And so the goal of learning is going from the top image, the top two images, to the bottom two images. Okay, so what are the actual solutions? How do you actually develop these connections? So firstly, just to address the skipping steps problem, it's really, really important when you're learning to not become a victim of this skipping steps issue. And so the key is that whenever you're learning or studying a concept or learning from an expert in some way, and something doesn't make complete sense, you must stop and drill into that concept. Because there's basically going to be some dependencies, some sub concepts that make up that concept you're trying to learn about that you don't understand, that have kind of been missed over or skipped or just never even acknowledged. And it's up to you, the learner, to independently figure out what those things are. Because unfortunately, that's the nature of this problem. That you have to figure out through your own kind of investigation what's the piece, the missing piece, that's the gap in your knowledge that's stopping you from fully understanding something. So if you are being explained something or you're reading about something and you don't understand it, it's likely to be a gap in your knowledge because of the skipping steps issue. So you need to stop and you need to drill into that and understand all the pieces of knowledge or concepts that make up that bigger concept and understand all of those things before you can understand the bigger concept. So that sounds really slow and really laborious, but it's actually completely necessary. And it's only going to slow you down in the long run if you allow yourself to kind of not fully understand these topics as you're learning them. And so for you as a learner, you always have the ability to know what doesn't make sense. So lean into that hard. Whenever something doesn't make complete sense, drill into it. Cool. So in terms of actually developing connections in your brain though, how does it work? Basically, your brain develops connections every time you develop a new understanding. Every time you understand something in a new way, that's quite literally your brain creating a new connection. And so the key, most important thing when you're learning is to get to meaning and understanding. And meaning, the definition of meaning is actually something that makes sense in the context of the knowledge you have. And so that's, again, it's all about connections. When you get to meaning, when something means something to you, it's embedded into your current knowledge and understanding of things. And so the more you can understand the meaning of things, and you can find different ways, different perspectives of understanding, that is all creating new connections in your brain. And so the most important thing when you're learning is that you must make sure that you prioritize getting to understanding and meaning. And it sounds obvious, but people don't always do it. People often skip over getting completely to understanding or meaning. And there's lots of reasons for that. People will, they'll think it's too hard, so they'll skip over, or it's taking too long, so they'll just go to the next topic, or they might think they're already meant to understand something, so they're embarrassed. They don't want to admit that they don't know. All of that is really, really harmful. You must forget all of those things and you must prioritize getting to understand everything that you're learning about. Otherwise, there'll be those lack of connections, those gaps, that's going to hurt you again in the long run. So get to meaning, get to understanding. So one key way to get more perspectives of understanding is to ask yourself these 5 questions I'm about to show you. These 5 questions, ask yourself them every time you want to understand a topic better or you've just learned something new. They will give you a good rounding of, if you can answer them, or the more you can try and answer them, they'll give you a good rounding of understanding and kind of connections. And so they are: how is this connected to your existing knowledge? Where and when can you apply this, and where doesn't it apply? What are the alternative ways to do this? How would you explain this concept to someone else? And if you got something wrong, understand why and how you would get it right next time.